Good evening and welcome to Hardfire. I'm your host, Joseph Dobrian, here with you for another 30 minutes of news and current events from a libertarian perspective. My guest tonight is a frequent guest on Hardfire. Always nice to see Brian Jones, former member of the Rolling Stones and now a well-known consulting actuary here in New York City. Mr. Jones, you are one of the leading experts in the city, I would imagine, on the subject of pensions. And that's a subject that's been very near to your heart for some time. And you, I understand, have come up with some ideas on how pension systems in general can be improved. So let's start by defining our terms. A lot of people, I think, have an imperfect idea of what pensions are, where they come from, and how they work. Can you give us a very brief rundown on all that?
Well, the basic idea that underlies a pension plan is that it's something that is tax favored. It's done, encouraged by government in order to produce retirement income and avoid people in their later years becoming public charges. The way it works is basically very simple, but unfortunately we forget about some of the simplicity sometimes. It's really a three-phase operation. Money flows in, money accumulates, and eventually benefits are paid out the other end. And government encourages these things by essentially giving tax deductions to money which goes in from the employer. It exempts from taxation the investment earnings, and it doesn't tax the benefits coming out until the other end. So that's a substantial encouragement, and in order to get those advantages, it imposes certain restrictions.
Okay. Now, the way a pension works in the private sector, correct me if I'm wrong, an employer will voluntarily contribute a small amount each year to a person's retirement account. At the same time, that employee is generally obliged to put a small amount of his earnings into that same account, correct?
Not quite. First of all, I'd quarrel with the idea that it's small. Pensions are pretty expensive animals. And also the contribution by the individual is much less common now, except in a 401k plan, which we can get to at some point. But in the conventional pension plan, the idea of employee contributions is going out of fashion these days. And one of the reasons for that is that government does not give a tax deduction for employee contributions as opposed to employer.
Right. So mostly then it's the employer who contributes to an employee's pension. And generally speaking, in the private sector, an employer is not obliged to set up a pension fund for his employees, correct?
That's correct.
But it's often something that's offered in order to attract workers to his business, correct?
Again, correct. Yep.
Okay. Now, governments, whether federal, state, or municipal, also tend to offer rather large, generous pensions, correct?
Yes, correct. Mm-hmm.
For example, I understand that in many cities, if you are a police officer, you can retire after 20 years with, I believe, 40%. In some jurisdictions, I believe it's 50% of your top pay.
That's correct.
And this is also true, at least in New York, of state employees and federal employees, I believe, have very, very high pensions.
Yes, the New York state pensions are being cut back prospectively for new entrants. They cannot constitutionally be cut back for people who are already on board. That's correct.
Okay. Now, the Social Security system is, I believe, a sort of pension fund. Is that correct?
Basically, it's the same idea, yes. Money flows in, it accumulates, and then is paid out the other end. That's
okay,
right.
Except that Social Security is not paid for by your employer. It is in part, but it's also
50-50.
It's also 50% your money that goes into it.
That's correct.
Okay. There are a lot of people who want to make Social Security voluntary. Do you go along with that? And if so, why? If not, why not?
No, I think that would be a total disaster. And it's been tried at least once in Chile, and that system is now coming apart. The idea of Social Security is to build a basic floor of retirement income, not to preempt the field, and just to, as I said, build a basic floor and to leave private pension plans to provide supplements on top of that.
Okay. Now, what we have in this country, as I see it, is a grave disparity between public and private pension funds. Public employees, as we've discussed, that is government employees at the federal, state, or municipal level, tend to have quite generous pensions paid for by the government. In other words, paid for by taxpayers. Meanwhile, people who work in the private sector are lucky to have any pension at all, and what pension they do have is usually much, much smaller than what they would have been getting if they had worked at the same salary for a governmental organization, correct?
Well, I don't think what you just stated is really a pension complaint. I think what you may be complaining about is that you think the total package of a public employee is disproportionately high as compared to that of a private employee.
Especially if it's being paid for by taxpayers.
We could argue about that, but the fact that the municipal unions have negotiated a very heavy emphasis on pensions, in other words, a large part of their package is going to pensions,
right,
I don't think gives you a valid pension complaint. If you think the total package is too high, we could have a separate argument about that, maybe. Okay. Or I might even agree with you. But I don't think, as I said, that you really have a pension complaint there.
Okay, well, I would not complain if I were getting that high of a pension myself. I don't begrudge them the money. After all, they probably went into government service because they had that pension in mind. That's that pie in the sky that they get just before they die.
I think that's right.
Yeah, and so they were playing the game for that prize, and they got it, so I don't begrudge it. However, I do feel a little bit bad for people who busted their humps in the private sector and end up with very little and end up living in penury in their last years. And I don't know how to remedy that situation except that you've just got to save a little more. But you...
Well, one thing you could do, of course, is to expand Social Security, but I assume that's not where you're going.
No, that's not what I would recommend, because quite aside from moral considerations, it appears to me that anything that's run by the government is going to be run very badly, very inefficiently compared to the private sector. But you, I understand...
Unlike the private banks, I take it.
Some banks do better than others. And usually the ones that stick to good, sound principles come out on top. You, though, I understand, have some ideas for revising the whole pension system, whether private or public. Maybe you could tell us about your plans.
Well, one of the important distinctions to be put on the table when we're dealing with pensions is the distinction between the defined contribution plan, and the 401k being the prime example. And the way that works is phase one, a fixed contribution flows in. Phase two, that the asset pool accumulates, and it accumulates at a rate of interest or rate of total earnings, which obviously varies over the lot and has gone negative recently in many cases. And that means that the contribution that flows out the other end is heavily variable. People are retiring and they're getting 2/3 of the pension that comparable people retiring 2 and 3 years ago might get. And that's built into the nature of the defined contribution plan because you fix the contribution and everything else is variable. The other type of plan is the defined benefit plan, which would include Social Security, most of the municipal funds that you're discussing, and a decreasing proportion of the private plans. And what happens there is that since the benefit flowing out the other end is fixed, the accumulation in the middle phase is obviously variable. the contribution cannot simultaneously be fixed. You just cannot do that. It has to vary if the defined benefit is going to flow out the other end.
Right. So sometimes the employer will have to pay a little more into the fund and sometimes a little less.
Sometimes an awful lot more.
And sometimes when he has to pay an awful lot more, it's at the worst possible time for him, correct?
Exactly, that's right. When there's an economic downturn that causes the problem in the asset accumulation phase, that is when economic conditions are bad, and the contributions, therefore, become very onerous.
Right, and consequently, he might have to lay off a few of his employees who are then just out of luck when it comes to collecting pensions later on.
Or he's going to scale back or terminate, get rid of the pension plan.
Right.
Now, the thing that I'm pushing at the moment and getting some reception from it, I've presented a paper on this in New York. I've got it on the website of the Society of Actuaries in the research section. I presented it in London a few months ago, and I'm scheduled now to present it again at the International Congress of Actuaries in South Africa. That'll be in a couple of months. And what I'm saying there is almost embarrassing for somebody who's been an actuary for 40 years. What I'm saying is that in the life insurance field, not in this country where life insurance is backed by fixed income investments, but in Britain where life insurance is backed mostly by equity investments, which have the same sort of variation. What happens there is that a British life insurance policy, which obviously has fixed premiums going in, the premiums do not vary once you've signed up for the policy. The accumulation of the investment income, of the asset pool, which is invested, obviously that is going to vary. And therefore what is done at the other end is that there is a basic guaranteed benefit and what's called a terminal dividend, which can vary and can vary very substantially. And that has been done by actuaries for many years to stabilize the life insurance policy. This, by the way, I should specify, is a participating policy where favorable experience flows through as dividends.
Okay.
In Britain, they call them bonuses.
Okay.
Now, I'm suggesting that the same thing should be done in pension plans. I don't believe you can have the same sort of variability that you have in British life insurance practice, but something comparable. and I would say that when we have the typical pension plan providing, let's say, 2% of pay per year of service out the other end.
Right.
These days, that kind of plan is going belly up.
Right.
It's being terminated because of primarily the investment problem we were just talking about.
Right.
In addition, the government regulation is getting to be oppressive.
Oh,
and
yes.
you'd love to hear that, I'm sure. We'll come back and hit that one again. But I'm suggesting that if instead of that 2% of pay plan, where if there's unfavorable experience, it gets reflected in contributions, as you point out, just at the wrong time. If that plan were replaced by one which provided, let's say, 1 1/3% per year of service out the other end, and as long as there was money in the kitty on a year-to-year basis, that 1 2/3 was boosted up to 2%. Then I think we'd have something that could be more easily maintained. Now, there is a risk that if the plan is terminated, even if we've funded it according to all the rules, and the 1 2/3 is pretty much locked in, there is a possibility that if the plan were terminated, that 2/3 supplement would not continue.
I see.
And that is not perfect. There's no doubt that everybody would much prefer to have a guaranteed 2% of pay plan.
Sure.
But if the 2% of pay plan is going to go belly up, or is threatened with going belly up, or is becoming less and less available, the alternative plan, in my opinion, is a very satisfactory alternative.
Okay, and how likely is it, do you think, that such a plan could be implemented on a large scale?
I think it could easily have been done way back when. To work a transition to it now would be tricky, but still doable.
And how would it be done?
By, let's see, there's one other thing I was going to talk about, which is the government guarantees. I would cut back the rate at which those benefits are accumulated to relate just to the period that a participant is in the plan.
Okay.
One of the big plans in the defined benefit plan, let's say our 2% of pay I was just talking about, if somebody comes in who is age 35, 30 years from retirement, the 2% per year of service will build up as the contributions flow in.
Right.
But in the real world, a plan is often created today, and we have a 50-year-old on board with 15 years of service remaining and 15 years of service under his belt. Now, the tendency is to grant those years of service for benefit purposes.
Right.
So that means that the plan comes into existence with large benefit expectations,
Right.
which would be expensive to meet.
Very.
And the contributions haven't happened, so we're in a catch-up phase.
Correct.
Now, I would say that the benefit that individual is going to get, I would still grant him the full 30 years of service for benefit purposes. So 30 years times 2% is 60%. But I would accrue it. That's something of a technical term, but we don't need to go into that now. I would accrue it over the years that he is actually working.
Okay.
Which means that the contributions are being made on essentially the same basis that the benefits are building up. Now, unfortunately, the current state of regulation does not permit you to do that.
And why is that? Why are there such regulations in place?
I think because the government regulation, by which I mean the statute and the regulations, are overly complicated, and they're done by people who obviously want to maximize the benefits to an employee to protect them to the maximum possible degree. And therefore they would say that the 2% of pay that I was just knocking is what we should work towards. And what I'm suggesting is a poor substitute.
Right.
And it is a less satisfactory scheme, but if it happens, and the first one doesn't happen, then it becomes quite desirable.
Yes, well, I think it's important to keep in mind that one major reason why government pensions are so much higher than private pensions is because the government, when they decide how much of a pension you're going to get, is not playing with their own money. They're playing with the taxpayers' money, and they want votes. And of course, government employees count for a great percentage of the electorate. So if they can keep pensions high with the taxpayers' money, that will keep the pension collectors voting for them and keep them in office. A private business owner is otherwise motivated. He is motivated by making profit for himself and keeping his employees happy and well-fed and well-paid, and he is going to find it much harder to do that if he is keeping the pensions high as well, correct?
No, I don't agree with that. I think the major distinction between government plans and private plans is one that nobody outside the actuarial community focuses on. And the actuarial community, I regret to say, does not explain it well, does not bring it front and center.
Okay, so bring it front and center. Here's your opportunity.
All right. In a government plan, even if, in my example, you create a plan, put a 50-year-old into it, you grant him back service all the way back here, you create a benefit obligation. I refuse to call it an unfunded liability because it's not a liability. It's a benefit expectation. You create a benefit expectation, and if your private plan runs for a few years and then terminates, that benefit expectation has been created and it must be paid. And therefore, there's an obligation in a private plan to pre-fund, to build up the assets till you reach a point that the plan could be terminated and everybody gets their benefit expectation. You could call it everybody gets what they've been promised, but I think that's an overstatement. Now, in a government plan, things are very different. In a government plan, the objective, it seems to me, should be to create a level flow of contributions as a percentage of payroll or whatever that will last indefinitely out into the future and will match all the benefit expectations. There is no reason in a government plan to quickly work towards a point where you can terminate the plan and pay everybody off. And the reason for that is that a private employer can go out of business, leaving benefit. Just let me finish the point. A private employer can go out of business, leaving benefit expectations that will not be fulfilled. Now, a government entity, other than a little ghost town out in Nevada, is not going to go out of business. Or more precisely, if it does go out of business, we've got an awful lot more to worry about than the stability of our pension plans.
Correct.
Therefore, there is no obligation in a government plan, and even more so in Social Security, to build up a huge pool of assets which will take care of all benefit expectations. And if we do that, then we have something which I think you would object to quite strongly. We have a huge pool of investment capital slopping around the markets under the overall direction of government, which I don't think appeals to you.
No, I wouldn't care for that. Okay, but now let's talk about private enterprise going out of business. Take a really big and theoretically really wealthy company like Enron a few years ago. They went belly up. What happened to all of those employees' pensions? I'm sorry to display my ignorance, but were they just SOL, as we say, or did they get something out of...
I'm not really familiar with the Enron situation, but Enron was a reasonably new company, or most of its workforce was reasonably new. I don't know how long the company had been around, but the bulk of the people who went out when Enron went belly up
were not heavily vested.
Well, they did not have a great deal of service.
Right.
And they were also not in the kind of defined benefit plan which I just described.
Okay.
I'm not 100% sure that's true, but I would bet on it.
Okay.
They had...
well, maybe that was a bad example.
Well, no, it wasn't, because
okay.
they had one other thing that I think we can legitimately point a finger at, which is that they had a defined contribution plan, and much of that defined contribution plan was invested back into Enron.
Okay.
Which is a serious situation. If you have a decent accumulation in your defined contribution pension plan,
it's not a good idea to invest it in your own
company. It's not a good
company,
idea to invest it in your own company, because when it goes belly up, so does your pension plan.
Right.
And that, I think, was the main problem with Enron.
Okay. But a company that has invested its pension fund in other enterprises, then if it goes belly up, that pension fund is still safe enough and they can use it to at least compensate their terminated employees to some degree, correct?
That's correct. And that's where people like me would say the government has a substantial role to make sure that those assets are properly segregated.
Okay.
And every now and then the government falls down on that, as the British government did with Maxwell.
Right.
You remember him?
Oh, yes. Now, let's go on very briefly to another subject, and that is what you do after you retire. A lot of people who have a small private fortune towards the end of their lives will want to live off 4% of it so that they can leave the principal to their children. Others say that they want to find a way that they can live a little better off of that and still leave that money to, still have a big piece of money to leave to their children. Is there a better way than just living off that 4%? Some way that your fortune can be structured so that you'll die broke, but you'll stay taken care of all your life and your children will still inherit.
Well, typically a retiree is looking to come close to maximizing his own income. And quite often his children will tell him that that's exactly what they want him to do. An exception being getting joint and survivor benefits with a spouse. Now, there are certainly various options that you could exercise in most plans that would provide a larger payout after death. You know, you can get something like a 20-year fixed guarantee. So if you survive only for 3 years, it keeps paying out for the rest of the other 17 to take care of the kids or whatever. Usually those options are available in private plans.
Okay, very good. So really there are a lot of different ways that a person can structure his retirement, whether or not he's getting a pension.
Yes.
And
yes. There are minimum payout requirements starting when you're age 7, well, and a half precisely. And you must take out at a certain rate.
Oh, I didn't realize that you actually had to take out.
The government does not want you to just keep everything inside the pension plan until your death and have it paid out to a dependent.
Okay, well, I can see why the government wouldn't like that.
Yeah.
Private people might enjoy that, but...
Well, the idea is that pension plans are there to provide pensions, which isn't
right.
that unreasonable a
and
proposition.
there are other ways to arrange inheritances.
Correct.
And on that note, you've given me and given our audience an awful lot to think about, and we've got so many more questions, but we've got to wrap it up for this time. So Brian Jones, thank you very much for coming on the show and sharing your ideas with us. I'm sure we'll have you on the show many more times. And best of luck to you, and best of luck to all of you. This is Joseph Dobrian. Good night from Hardfire.